Okay, class, if this looks a little peculiar, it's because I'm recording from my iPhone. No microphone, because that's hooked up to the computer, and I have a sneaky suspicion that when Mr. Nedgley interrupted and I hit pause on the recording, for whatever reason, this started a technical glitch that made it so you can't hear much after that 11 minutes. You can hear it, but then it kind of speeds up, slows down, gets real glitchy, and then, of course, I'm already uncomfortable with my face on screen as it is. Boy, have those little moments where you just see your face intermittently frozen. Ugh. So, ladies and gentlemen, I re-recorded this section. I'm probably going to be looking at the wrong place. Where am I supposed to look? There? It just seems weird. So I guess I'll appear to be looking off screen. My apologies. But the good news is that if you watch the first 11 minutes of that other video, you got to see the share screen that you needed to see. You got to see the colonies and what they're known for. We didn't really even have any share screen for this portion. And I did have some props laid out to talk about the Hannah story, but it wasn't that great anyway. So when I retell it, we'll just explain it a little bit better. So let's talk about what's going on in the Chesapeake. Now, they call it the unhealthy Chesapeake. They talk about Chesapeake Bay. We're talking about Jamestown. We're talking about Virginia. We're talking about that region. So Bailey has established all of the colonies. He's sort of giving you a brief narrative about what they're known for in general. But he hasn't yet told you about sort of how it's developing socially. And what they're going to do is focus on this major event in the Chesapeake, in Virginia. And it all has to do with what saves Virginia. So Virginia, if you recall, is saved by tobacco. Tobacco becomes this crop that makes it so that they're a fiscally viable community. And tobacco is a poor man's crop, as you know from the last essay, which you guys crushed, because it's pretty easy to grow in the scheme of things. It doesn't take a lot of refinement. It's well within a year. So something weird happens with tobacco that actually can happen with any sort of cash crop. And that is I have no idea where I'm supposed to be looking still. That's okay. I'll just be looking this way. Virginia is producing so much tobacco. There is a big demand for tobacco, but there's so much production of tobacco that even though the demand peaks, it does level off, but the production keeps going up. So supply and demand dictates then that the price of tobacco starts to go down because they're so good at producing tobacco. So what's your solution? Well, at that time, it's grow even more tobacco to make up for the lost revenue that you have because the price of tobacco is going down, which, by the way, makes the price of tobacco go down even further because you've increased the supply. So what does that mean? Well, what it means is that families who have been growing tobacco, Bailey literally says they can't have enough kids to keep up with the demand of the labor. The reason that agricultural societies then and now often have so many children is because extra children or extra labor, at the very least, equals out. And at best, you're actually able to produce more than you consume. So Bailey says they can't have kids fast enough. The farms need to grow faster than the workforce can naturally just be a family. Now, Bailey then goes into an economic discussion about options that are explored and used. And I want you to realize that Bailey is going to intertwine the moral problems with it later in the narrative, but at first, when he lays it out, he does not really talk about the moral implications. And I think he does this because clearly the colonists are not thinking about the moral implications. So essentially he goes through this list and says, okay, well, how would you solve this labor problem? They first look to potentially Native Americans. Well, the reason they don't go with Native Americans, and we're probably talking about enslaving Native Americans, is because they die too fast. So the colonists are not having a moral issue with enslaving Native Americans. They're having a practical issue of them dying too soon, which should be very upsetting to you, but this is their thought process. They then are looking at the possibility of slavery. Well, why didn't more people use slaves? Again, they seem to be ignoring the huge moral ramifications of that. But I guess temporarily it doesn't matter. It certainly does, but it doesn't matter because fiscally, the average tobacco farmer just has no chance of affording slaves, which, again, the moral problems of it should be the number one factor, but Bailey correctly recognizes that from the perspective of the colonists, the issue is too poor. So they come up with this other system. And this had been evolving in different places in different areas at different times, but it really becomes common in this era, called the headright or indentured servant system. Under indentured servitude, somebody who was poor in England, who wanted to get a new start, who felt they had very few options in the old world, could sign up to be an indentured servant. Now, essentially, a contract would be signed where they would say, I'm going to voluntarily indenture. It's not slavery, because I want to make sure there's a clear difference. Slavery is not a choice. Slavery has no ending according to, sort of the philosophy of things at that time period. Indentured servitude has a clear ending, there's a clear contract, and the decision is made by the person being put into indentured servitude. But sort of in a colloquial way, what's it like? It's sort of like being enslaved voluntarily for 7 years, but again, I have some issues with that. But essentially, you're so desperate, you're willing to say, I will become your worker and not get paid for work for usually 7 years. Now, if you had a special skill, maybe you're a blacksmith, you could negotiate, and it was not uncommon, a 3 or 4 year term of indentured servitude. Or if you were really bad at negotiating or didn't know what you were signing, you might get 10 years. But I think 10 years is even more uncommon than 3 or 4. Almost, I'd say the overwhelming majority were 7 years. There's a few special exceptions for 3 or 4, and even less common exceptions of longer. So under this system, you get brought over to the New World. You work for your time, probably 7 years. And at the end of that time, you get a barrel of food, corn usually, and a new set of clothes. That's it. So you were poor in Great Britain, and now you're poor in the New World, 7 years later. Now, the enticement is there's more options in the New World. In England, what are you going to do? There's no more land to discover or conquer. You are going to essentially have to buy land in England. You're broke. So going into the New World, at least you have the option to go to the frontier. And if you go to the frontier, you can try to eke out your own homestead. But of course, when you go to eke out your own homestead, what you're essentially doing is, well, not essentially, you are stealing land from Native Americans. And of course, they're not going to take that lightly, and often you're going to get attacked. And so the people on the frontier are the people who are getting attacked by the natives because they're on that cutting edge of the English society. Also under the headright system, or this system, the person who sponsored you, that's the person who gets free land. They get 50 acres of land that might be in a more protected area. The free land does not go to the person who worked for 7 years. It goes to the person who sponsored the person, who paid for the voyage over. Now, is it fair? There is no right or wrong answer. This is an opinion question. I want you to answer it in your essay, and I'm going to judge you by how well you articulate your opinion and have some sort of justification, not on what your answer is, because I suspect they'll have different answers. If you argue that it's fair, you would say, listen, it's not a great thing, but if you say, I'm going to do it, and you know what you're in for, then it's fair. Others will say, well, it's not fair. These are people that are desperate and have few other choices. You're taking advantage of people when you take somebody who has so few other choices. I get both arguments. And then you could say, well, to really understand the contract, you'd have to be able to read the contract, and the literacy of the average poor person in England in the 1600s is, it's not terribly likely. We have a lot of these indentured servitude contracts that the signature is an X. It's not a signature. So to help explore, though, whether it's fair or not, I have this supplemental textbook called The American Spirit Reader. Now, there's actually two sets of these, Spirit Reader 1, Volume 1, and Volume 2 for time periods. And instead of giving you these two books, I just, when I want a story from those, just use those pages. And that's what those supplements are. So I'm going to go over the first one, which is, in yours, you'll have something along the lines of number 3 and number 4. And these are hard to interpret because of the language that they're in, but I'm just going to read through a couple highlights here and make sure you understand them. Sometimes when I'm reading, by the way, you'll say, I take my glasses off. Yes, I'm an old man. And you go, well, if you're an old man, you need your glasses. Glasses are more for seeing distance. Close up anymore, because maybe I need bifocals. I have to take them off to really be able to see, so make fun of me later. Okay, so servant girl pays the wages of sin. This one's pretty easy to understand. A indentured servant by the name of Anne got pregnant while she was an indentured servant, and her punishment is they doubled her time of indentured servitude. Well, what does that mean? Probably 7 years. So because she got pregnant, and I'm sure she was unable to work for a time period, she had to double her service. That seems really harsh to me. But I can hear those of you who I suspect will say the system is fair but was it written in the rules? Then maybe it is. Now, if you don't want to use that one, you can use the other one. You don't have to use both. The other one is an unruly servant is punished. And this one is longer and it's more confusing. But I want to help you interpret a little bit of old language because I think it is a fascinating story that shows some inequity in ways that you don't even have to address. So this servant has, his master is a woman, and he goes into her room at night with a naked rapier. Now, a rapier, I'd used that term before, is a curved knife. Sometimes you'll see it as a very short sword. Okay, it's a weapon. And naked in this case means unsheathed. So it's a knife that's been pulled out, okay? So he's got this knife. He's in her room with the knife, and he jumps on her and says he would not kill her if she would let him lie with her all night and bade her to go to bed with him. We have an attempted sexual assault here. And she is fighting back. And she, at one point, escapes the room, is running outside. He catches her. He stands over her and puts the knife to her throat and threatens her again, demanding what he's demanding in this sexual assault. He then takes her petticoats, which is basically like sort of your undergarments under a dress, and flips them over her head and hits her 2 or 3 times in the face. By the way, she has several cuts because she's holding her hands against her throat to prevent him from slicing her throat. She ends up with 6 or 7 cuts on her hands. And essentially, it's not clear how this actually ended. She gets away. She is assaulted, absolutely, but it's an attempted sexual assault. She was not raped. So, what happens to him? He gets 39 lashes on his bare back. Now, I will say at that time, that could kill you. That could cause some infection and kill you. His hair's cut off and he has to wear an iron collar. I don't know if it's clear here how long he has to wear the iron collar, but I think for a year. And then he gets 3 years added to his indentured servitude. Okay, I guess I'm hung up on the idea that a girl gets pregnant and she gets probably 7 years added to her indentured servitude, and this guy tries to rape someone and really threaten to murder them, and he gets 3 years, although the lashes are no small matter. You don't have to address that inequity between the sexes. You could just address whether or not you think in general the system is fair, using that as an example, but that's an example of the sort of punishments under the system. Now, indentured servants, again, once they're free of that system, they're given their food, a barrel of food, and they're given some clothes, and then they're just broke in the new world. Well, what do? You head to the frontier. I guess for my examples today, over here is going to be the frontier. So they head to the frontier and just try to eke out a home, a farm. And again, hard work, but remember, they're stealing that land from Native Americans. And so Native Americans are often going to attack the English colonists for always encroaching on their land. And when they attack, they don't go around all the English people on the frontier and then attack the city like Jamestown. What they do is they attack the people who they encounter first, which are the people on the frontier. And the people on the frontier sometimes suffer some pretty horrible things. And a great story of that comes from another book I'm saving you from. And this is, I think I have it labeled like HD 1, 2, and 3, Hannah Dunstan story, pages 1, 2, and 3. And it's from this book. And I'm going to go over this story. I'm going to try to help you visualize some of the things that are going on. And essentially, I want you to summarize this story for the essay as well. And so you'll have to read it to really do a good job. I'm just, I don't want you to have to rewrite the whole thing by any stretch, but I want to, your sort of narrative. But essentially, I want you to try to visualize the scenario that they're in. Sorry, I'm looking at the clock because I have a live class in 15, so hopefully we're done by then. We have a scenario where we have a house, say here, okay? And then the woods, the frontier, the rest of the frontier out here. This house is on the exterior of this sort of settlement where there are other houses. And there are enough houses that actually, in this direction, over here, there's a fort. And I assume there's a fort because they've been attacked before. And at this house is this woman named Hannah who had just given birth, I think 2 days prior to this, so very recently. And then there's a midwife, and then their baby, whose name escapes me at this exact moment. I'll look in the book here. And then you got Thomas, who's the husband, who's outside at 7 in the morning. He's working out in his fields. He's here, and his children are sort of between here and the fort. And Thomas looks towards his house because he hears something, and what he sees is a group of Abenaki Native Americans. Now, the Abenaki were aligned with the French. They had been converted to Catholicism. They do not like the English. They're encroaching on their land, and the English are generally Protestant. And so he knows, oh my gosh, we're being attacked. Now, what he does has been debated by historians for a long time, but I think a lot of people, including myself, have a pretty decent idea of why he made the decision, and I personally don't fault him for the decision he made, but it's going to be a very tough one. Sometimes when you're in a horrible situation, if you're lucky, you have the ability to make fast decisions that can be perceived sometimes as almost cold or calculating, but probably are the right decisions to make, because you just have to act, because if you do nothing, even worse things are going to happen. And what I suspect is that Thomas looked over at Hannah in the house and very quickly did the math. If he's here and he's on a horse and he does have a gun, he could probably get to that house about the same time that the Abenaki do. But there's at least a dozen in this raiding party. He's one man, one gun. If he makes it, he's probably going to die defending his wife and newborn. And the midwife is a nurse, the nurse. And his children, who are scattered about in these fields, might not get to the fort because they might panic. And he's going to lose everything and everyone. But if he can somehow, some way, turn off his mind from imagining what could happen to his wife and newborn and this nurse midwife and go this direction, maybe he can save his other children. You wouldn't want to have to make this decision. This would be horrendous. But he does. He gets on his horse and he runs towards his other children in the fort. And at one point, he even discusses that he is essentially going to say, I'm just going to have to pick up one of my kids. I'm going to have to let, I think he says, like, God, direct me to one of my children. I'll pick him up and we'll go to the fort. And then he decides he can't do that. He can't do that. So he ends up hopping off of his horse, pointing his gun at the attackers, who are now probably closing the gap. And I think the book says running at the pace of a 5-year-old. So his slowest child. Now remember, these guns take about a minute to load, and he's got one shot. And so it's not like today where you could, shoot all of the potential attackers. He has to kind of like make sure that nobody wants, you don't want to be the one that I use this bullet on, and he's sort of able to get closer and closer to the fort as they decide, the Abenaki decide this is less and less worth it, and eventually he is able to get all of his children, except for the newborn, to safety. I'm not going to judge him for that decision. I think he made the incredibly difficult but correct decision. That leaves Hannah, though, back at the house to deal with what is going to happen next. And so the Abenaki go through this house and they just start rifling through everything and they take everything. Now, what's going to happen next is far worse than any property, but from the perspective of a freed indentured servant, like they've made it now. They've got their own little village with a fort, and they've got their own house. And I think they mentioned that they rebuilt this house, and it might have even been brick. I can't remember off the top of my head, but they just rebuilt this house. And now it's just all going to be gone because the Native Americans, the Abenaki in this case, steal what they can and then torch the house. Grab the midwife, and they grab Hannah, and they grab the baby. And so the baby, Martha, I think is her name. Yeah. Martha is pulled out of Hannah's hands, grabbed by the feet, and they swing Martha around and hit her head against a tree. So, if you're Hannah, I don't think it's a big stretch to say that you're in shock. You're in some sort of horrific shock. You've just given birth 2 days ago. And listen, I'm sure you've known somebody who's given birth. That is a physical, I don't know, hardship that obviously I can't entirely explain, but I know that it can be very difficult to move around for days and in some cases weeks afterwards. So she's going through a physical hardship because she's about to go on a 12-mile walk. March, really. She's going through an emotional trauma that I wouldn't want to wish on my worst enemy. And she then is just told, after she witnesses this, that, march or die. And there are other captives. They're not the only ones. It's not just Mary and Hannah. There are other people from this settlement, village, whatever you want to call it. And some of them are not able to keep pace. And the Abenaki strike them down. They kill them right there on the spot. You've got to be able to keep pace. Hannah somehow keeps pace, even though she had just given birth 2 days earlier, and even though she just watched her infant get murdered. And I've got to think that she's in complete and utter shock. I mean, I think that's the only way to explain it. So Hannah then gets taken. The Abenaki then divide up the prisoners that they've accumulated. And they get to closer and closer to sort of this Abenaki village, this main base. And the Abenaki now have her and Mary Neff and a boy from some other village that they captured along the way. And these three are in the hands of 2 adult men, 2 adult women. There might be 4 adult men. It gets a little dicey. And then those families, their children. And the man who originally captured her was in that raid, tells her, you're going to be stripped down naked tomorrow and run the gauntlet. And if you don't know what the gauntlet is, it's 2 rows of people, and they're going to have weapons and attack you on either side. Now, there's some speculation that actually that's not what was going to happen at all, that she was going to be sold into slavery, but you've got to understand, for a Puritan woman, the thought of having to strip down naked, that humiliation, and probably die in the gauntlet, because, as you try to run through this, people are going to be striking you with these weapons, who had just gone through this physical and emotional trauma beyond description, it makes her snap. So that night, got a text message. Hopefully you can't see it. I mean, it's not bad. But that night, she makes a decision that she's going to try to escape by murdering her captors. So she and the boy get a hold of 2 hatchets in the middle of the night, and then she proceeds to, I'll read this, attack the 12 sleeping Abenaki with grim determination and deadly aim. By the time they finish, 10 of the Native Americans lay dead. Another, sorely wounded, ran away into the woods, and a 12th, whom Dunstan was going to keep as a captive, managed to escape. She then proceeded to scalp the 10 that were killed, including the 2 dead men, one of which was the one who captured her, and 2 dead women, along with the 6 dead children. Ladies and gentlemen, if you are Hannah, I don't know that I can judge what she's done too harshly because of what she'd gone through. However, she did some horrible things too. And if you're a Native American who comes across this scene, you can't believe that somebody would scalp children. But again, if you're Hannah, you can't believe that somebody murdered your infant by smashing its head up against a tree. The point is, many horrible things have happened in both directions. And after this sort of horrific cycle starts, there's no talking to either side, because each side has their atrocities that they've witnessed or known people who've gone through. And so there's just no hearing about how we should make peace with that other side. Now, Hannah's story actually happens in 1697, maybe. It's after Bacon's Rebellion. But I still use it as an example for what represents the frustration of Bacon's Rebellion, because it's such a strong, powerful narrative of the sort of thing that's absolutely going on during Bacon's Rebellion. It's just we have this better writing, this better exemplar of it. So it's not technically one of the things that happened in Bacon's Rebellion, but that sort of thing was happening in that era all the time. So how does this lead to a rebellion? Well, I'm running a little long on time, and I'm going to let you fill into some of the details. But the idea is, this guy named Nathaniel Bacon, right around 1676, who's frustrated that all these attacks are going on the frontier, and the governor, Berkeley, doesn't seem to want to do anything about it. Now, from Berkeley's perspective, he's looking around going, well, I have a fur trade with Native Americans, and I don't perceive this as big of a problem. Well, sure, he's in Jamestown. He's in the interior. If you're on the frontier, this is the biggest problem in your life. And so Nathaniel Bacon gets a bunch of freed indentured servants who are frustrated, and they gather a force of, I think, right around 1,000 men, and they start killing Native Americans indiscriminately. Some of the Native Americans they are attacking are enemies, and some were very friendly to the English. He's non-discriminatory in his hatred towards Native Americans. He just hates them all. And they start murdering Native Americans, and Berkeley says, hey, you can't do that. Hey, you cannot do that. Dude, this is wrong. And Bacon says, oh, I can't, and then turns inward and heads to Jamestown to capture Berkeley and threatens his life. Berkeley escapes. So Bacon burns down Jamestown, burns down the capital at that time of this colony. And I mean, as I was reading this the first time in college, I was like, oh my gosh, what's going to happen next? And then, rather, anticlimactically, Bacon just dies. Bacon dies of some unrelated disease, just dies in the middle of this rebellion. And without his leadership, the whole thing just sort of falls apart. Berkeley asserts power again, executes a whole bunch of people that are perceived as leaders in this. And so this rebellion just shows this immense frustration that is going on, but it changes things, because we understand why they're frustrated. But for the people like Berkeley, who are the people who are benefiting from the head right system, bringing people over, they look around and go, oh my gosh, these freed indentured servants are a pain. These guys are rabble-rousers. Maybe we should find a less bothersome source of labor. And again, setting aside the moral qualms of it, the solution they find is, well, we didn't think we could afford slaves, but maybe that's what we'll have to do, because having unruly indentured servants running around after their servitude is up is too dangerous, hence proved by Bacon's Rebellion. And so that's when you start to see slavery, which it'd been introduced in 1619, but just frankly wasn't numerically common. It's morally horrible no matter when it happens or how many times it's happening. But now this morally reprehensible thing goes from being something that is rare, at least in the English colonies in North America, not in the West Indies, very common there, to being much more accepted. And we'll get into that a little bit more on Monday. I'm sorry you had to click on 2 videos for this. Hopefully the sound and video of this one is a little bit better. All right, everybody, I will talk to you tomorrow.